I found out about the affair on a Wednesday evening in September. Not through confrontation or confession, but through sheer accident, the kind of mundane mistake that unravels carefully constructed lies in an instant. Jennifer had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. We'd been married 9 years, together for 12, and in all that time I'd never felt the need to look at her private messages or check her devices. Trust was the foundation of our relationship, or so I believed. We had shared passwords, shared bank accounts, shared everything in the way couples do when they have built a life together over more than a decade. Privacy existed, but it was the kind of comfortable privacy that came from respect rather than suspicion. But that evening, while making dinner, her screen lit up with a notification. A message preview appeared at the top, just a few words visible before it faded. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, same hotel?" The sender was listed as D with a heart emoji, not a name I recognized, not a contact from her work or friend group that I knew about. Just a letter and a symbol that carried implications I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. I stood there with a knife in one hand and a half-chopped onion on the cutting board, staring at the screen as it went dark again. My mind ran through possible explanations, each one more desperate and implausible than the last. Maybe it was a friend planning a surprise. Maybe it was a work colleague using some kind of internal code for a legitimate business meeting. Maybe I'd misread it entirely, mistaken innocent text for something sinister. Maybe the message wasn't even for her, some weird routing error or wrong number situation, but I knew. On some level, in the part of my brain that processes truth before conscious thought can construct comfortable lies, I knew exactly what that message meant. I opened her laptop. No password required, because we'd never had that kind of relationship, never felt the need to lock each other out of our digital lives or hide our communications from each other. Her messaging app was right there on the screen, dozens of conversations organized by contact name, recent messages highlighted at the top of the list. D with a heart emoji was at the very top. I clicked on it before I could talk myself out of looking, before common sense or respect for privacy could override the need to know what was happening in my marriage. D was David Chen, my boss, my direct supervisor for the past 3 years at Meridian Systems, a mid-sized software company where I worked as a senior product manager. The man who'd hired me, mentored me, advocated for my promotions, and apparently been sleeping with my wife for almost half a year. The messages were explicit, detailed, filled with the kind of intimacy that can't be mistaken for anything other than what it was. They met at hotels downtown twice a week, usually on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when I was in late meetings or working on project deadlines. They talked about me occasionally, mostly Jennifer complaining that I was too focused on work, too comfortable with our routine, too unwilling to take risks or pursue the kind of lifestyle she wanted. David's responses were sympathetic, understanding, promising her that he could offer her more than I ever could. He made twice my salary as VP of Product Development. He drove a Tesla, he owned a condo in the city and a vacation house in the mountains. He moved in circles I'd never been part of, attending company executive retreats and industry conferences where spouses weren't invited. I sat at that kitchen counter for 2 hours, reading through months of betrayal, watching my marriage dissolve into a series of text messages and hotel reservations and explicit expressions of feelings that should have been reserved for our relationship. Every message was another small cut, another piece of evidence that the life I thought I was living had been an illusion for half a year. When Jennifer came home around 8, finding me still sitting there with her laptop open and dinner abandoned on the counter half prepared, she didn't apologize or try to explain immediately. She didn't rush to close the laptop or deny what I'd found. She just stood in the doorway, her work bag still over her shoulder, and asked flatly, "How much did you read?" The question itself was an admission. No confusion about what I'd found, no attempt to claim I'd misunderstood or invaded her privacy inappropriately. Just an immediate acceptance that I knew and a pragmatic question about the extent of my knowledge. I told her enough. All of it. Everything I needed to see to understand what had been happening while I'd been going to work and coming home and believing we had a normal, stable life together. 5 months of affair, documented in intimate detail, complete with future plans and complaints about our marriage and promises about what their relationship could become if circumstances were different. She sat down at the counter across from me, maintaining physical distance as if the space between us could somehow make this conversation more manageable. She said she'd been planning to tell me, that she'd fallen in love with David and wanted to end our marriage cleanly, with honesty and respect. The irony of using those words after 5 months of lying every single day wasn't lost on me, but I was too numb to point it out effectively. I asked her how long she was going to let this continue before telling me. Days? Weeks? Months? How much longer would she have kept playing the role of faithful wife while planning her exit and building a new relationship behind my back? She said she didn't know. She'd been waiting for the right time, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage, hoping maybe the feelings would fade naturally and she could just end it without blowing up our marriage and both of our lives. But the feelings hadn't faded. They'd intensified. David had become the person she thought about constantly. The relationship that felt alive and exciting compared to the comfortable routine we'd fallen into over 9 years of marriage. I asked if David knew she was married. It seemed like a stupid question given everything I'd read, but I needed to hear her say it. Needed confirmation that this wasn't some misunderstanding where he'd been deceived along with me. She said of course he knew. He'd known from the beginning, from the first time they'd had drinks after a product strategy meeting and realized there was chemistry between them. That had been part of the arrangement, she said, as if having an explicit understanding about the adultery made it somehow more acceptable, more mature than a simple affair born from deception. I moved out that night, taking enough clothes and personal items to last a few days, and checking into a hotel near the office. I didn't know what else to do. The condo was in both our names, but I couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep in a bed I now knew she'd been sharing with thoughts of another man. I called in sick to work Thursday and Friday. I needed time to think, to process what had happened, to figure out what came next. I knew I'd have to face David eventually, that we'd have to have some kind of conversation about this situation. But I wasn't ready yet. Jennifer filed for divorce the following Monday. She must have had the papers already prepared, already consulted with a lawyer, already planned her exit strategy. The speed of it suggested this had been in motion for longer than just the discovery. She'd been ready to leave, just waiting for the right moment or the right excuse. The firing. I went back to work on Monday, determined to maintain some kind of professional normalcy despite the chaos in my personal life. I'd decided to handle the David situation quietly, to request a transfer to a different department or team where I wouldn't have to report directly to him. It seemed like the mature approach, the way to minimize drama and protect my career while my marriage fell apart. I never got the chance to make that request. David called me into his office at 10 in the morning, less than an hour after I'd arrived at my desk. I'd been at work for maybe 45 minutes, trying to catch up on emails and project updates from the 2 days I'd missed, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in my professional life while my personal life disintegrated. His assistant delivered the message in person, appearing at my cubicle with an uncomfortable expression and a quiet request that I join David in his office when convenient. When convenient, in corporate speak, meant immediately. I knew that. Everyone knew that. When an executive's assistant personally delivered a message requesting your presence, you dropped what you were doing and went. When I walked into his office, Sarah Martinez from HR was already there, sitting in one of the chairs across from David's desk with a folder in front of her and a carefully neutral expression on her face. That's when I knew this wasn't about work, wasn't about projects or deadlines or team dynamics or any of the normal reasons a product manager might be called into his supervisor's office. HR only showed up for serious situations, the kind that involved documentation and potential legal implications, the kind where the company needed a witness and a representative to ensure proper procedures were followed. David didn't look at me when I entered. He kept his eyes on a document in front of him, his expression carefully neutral and professional, as if we were strangers meeting for the first time rather than colleagues who'd worked together for 3 years, and whose personal lives had become catastrophically intertwined. Sarah gestured to the empty chair beside her and asked me to sit down. She explained that the company had received concerns about my recent performance and conduct. Multiple concerns, she emphasized, from various sources, both internal and external, to my immediate team. These concerns included reports of missed deadlines on critical product features, incomplete work that had required other team members to step in and finish, and unprofessional behavior toward colleagues in meetings and email communications. The pattern of issues, she said, had been escalating over the past several months and had reached a point where the company no longer felt confident in my ability to perform at the level expected of a senior product manager. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing, trying to match her description with my actual performance and experience over the past months. Performance issues? Missed deadlines? I'd been with the company 5 years, received excellent reviews every performance cycle without exception, been promoted twice based on my strong delivery and leadership capabilities, and led successful product launches that had generated millions in revenue. My most recent performance review, completed just 3 months earlier in June, had rated me as exceeding expectations in every single category and had included a merit increase and bonus payout. I asked what specific issues they were referring to. What deadlines had I missed? What work had been incomplete? Who had complained about my behavior? Sarah said she couldn't discuss specific details due to confidentiality policies designed to protect the people who'd raised concerns, but she assured me that the decision had been made after careful consideration and review of thoroughly documented concerns from multiple sources. Then she delivered the actual termination decision. My employment was ending immediately, effective that day. They'd arranged for 2 weeks severance, which she characterized as generous given the performance-based nature of the termination. I needed to pack my belongings, return my company property, and leave within the hour. Security would escort me to ensure a smooth transition. I looked at David, trying to force some acknowledgement of what was really happening. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. He just nodded slightly, confirming what Sarah was saying, backing up the official story with his silent authority, as the supervisor who'd made the decision to terminate me. I realized then what was happening. This wasn't about my performance. This was about removing me from the situation, eliminating the problem of having the husband of his girlfriend working directly under him. Maybe Jennifer had asked him to do it. Maybe he'd decided on his own that it was too complicated, too risky to have me around. Or maybe he just wanted to flex his power, to demonstrate that he could destroy my career as easily as he'd destroyed my marriage. I said I wanted to appeal the decision. Sarah said terminations for performance issues weren't subject to appeal, but I was welcome to submit a written statement that would be included in my personnel file. She handed me a separation agreement to sign, acknowledging the terms of my departure and releasing the company from any liability related to my employment or termination. I refused to sign it. Sarah said that was my right, but without the signed agreement, I wouldn't receive the severance payment. The company had no obligation to pay me anything beyond my final wages for time worked, which would be deposited according to the normal payroll schedule. I walked out of that office in a daze. Security was already waiting outside David's door, a young guy I'd seen in the lobby but never spoken to. He followed me to my desk and stood there while I packed my few personal items into a box. A framed photo of Jennifer and me from our wedding, which I left behind. A coffee mug from a product launch 2 years ago. Some notebooks and pens. Nothing important, nothing that mattered anymore. My colleagues pretended not to watch as I was escorted through the office. Some of them knew what was happening, had probably already heard the gossip or been warned to expect my departure. Others just looked confused, wondering why someone was being walked out by security in the middle of a Monday morning. The security guard escorted me all the way to the parking garage, watched me put my box in my car, and then waited until I drove away before returning to the building, as if I might try to sneak back in, might cause some kind of scene or become a security threat. I drove to the hotel where I'd been staying and sat in the parking lot for an hour. I'd lost my wife and my job in less than 10 days. The 2 pillars of my adult life, the structures I'd built my identity around, both gone in a span that barely qualified as a crisis. It felt like being in free fall, like the ground had disappeared beneath me and I was just waiting to hit bottom. The fall. The severance issue became complicated quickly. Because I hadn't signed the separation agreement, Meridian Systems took the position that they had no obligation to pay me anything beyond my final paycheck for the days I'd actually worked. That amounted to roughly $6,000 after taxes, barely enough to cover 2 months of basic expenses. I consulted with an employment lawyer, a woman named Rachel Park, who specialized in wrongful termination cases. She reviewed my situation and said I had a potentially strong case. Being fired 10 days after discovering that my wife was having an affair with my boss created an obvious timeline that suggested retaliation rather than legitimate performance concerns. The fact that my recent performance reviews were excellent, that no documentation of problems existed before the termination, and that I'd been given no warning or opportunity to improve, all pointed to a termination that wasn't actually based on performance. But she also warned me that wrongful termination cases were expensive and time-consuming. The legal fees could easily exceed $50,000, and even if I won, the company would likely settle for much less than that amount. More importantly, suing a former employer made you essentially unemployable in the industry. No company wanted to hire someone who'd sued their previous workplace, regardless of the circumstances or the merits of the case. Rachel suggested I try to negotiate a better severance package without filing suit. She drafted a letter outlining my concerns about the termination, noting the suspicious timing and lack of documented performance issues, and proposing a settlement that would include 6 months severance and a neutral employment reference. The letter carefully avoided making direct accusations about David and Jennifer, but the implications were clear enough that Meridian's legal team would understand the potential risks of my situation. The company responded 3 weeks later. They denied any impropriety in my termination and reiterated that the decision had been based solely on legitimate performance concerns. However, in the interest of avoiding unnecessary legal costs and prolonged dispute, they were willing to offer an enhanced severance package of 3 months' salary in exchange for signing a comprehensive release and non-disparagement agreement. 3 months was better than nothing, but it still meant I'd have about $30,000 to live on while searching for a new job in a market that had suddenly become much more hostile to me. Rachel advised me to take it, noting that prolonging the negotiation would likely cost more in legal fees than I'd gain in additional severance. I signed the agreement and received the payment a week later. The job search was brutal from the start, more difficult and demoralizing than anything I'd experienced in my professional life. I'd been in product management for 8 years, working my way up from associate product manager fresh out of business school to senior product manager, leading significant initiatives and managing cross-functional teams. I had a solid network of industry contacts built through years of conferences and professional networking. I had a polished resume showcasing successful product launches and quantifiable business results. I had demonstrable skills in strategy, execution, stakeholder management, and technical leadership. None of it mattered once potential employers started checking references. The problem was systemic and unavoidable. Every recruiter and hiring manager wanted to speak with my most recent supervisor, which meant David Chen. Standard practice in hiring was to verify employment and performance with the candidate's direct manager from their most recent role. And when they called Meridian's HR department for employment verification, they received the bare minimum information that legal departments typically provide. Confirmation of my dates of employment from August 5 years ago to September of this year, confirmation of my final title as senior product manager, and a terse note that I was not eligible for rehire. That single phrase, those 4 words buried in an otherwise unremarkable verification, was a career death sentence in the professional world. It signaled to potential employers that something significant had gone wrong in my tenure, that there were serious problems or concerns that had made the company decide they would never want me back under any circumstances. It raised questions that couldn't be adequately answered without getting into complicated personal situations that made me sound defensive or bitter. Even companies that seemed genuinely interested in my background and experience, that brought me in for multiple rounds of interviews and gave every indication that an offer was forthcoming, cooled immediately after checking references with Meridian. The conversations would shift from enthusiastic, "We're really excited about bringing you on board," to cautious, "We need a bit more time to evaluate candidates," to final, "We've decided to move forward with other candidates who are a better fit at this time." I tried to work around the problem by explaining the situation in carefully vague terms during interviews. I'd tell recruiters and hiring managers that I'd left my previous role due to a personal situation involving a conflict of interest with my supervisor, and that the termination hadn't been directly related to my actual job performance or technical capabilities. But vagueness raised more questions than it answered. What kind of conflict of interest? Why hadn't I reported it through proper channels? Why had it resulted in my termination rather than the supervisor's? The more I tried to explain without revealing the full story about David and Jennifer, the more suspicious and evasive I sounded. Some recruiters were sympathetic. They'd worked in the industry long enough to know that office politics and personal relationships sometimes created situations where good employees got caught in crossfire. But sympathy didn't translate to job offers. Companies had policies, and those policies generally excluded candidates who'd been terminated for cause from previous employers. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings were grinding forward. Jennifer's lawyer had filed for immediate separation, claiming irreconcilable differences and requesting an equitable division of assets. We'd accumulated modest savings during our marriage, around $40,000, and the condo had about $80,000 in equity. Jennifer wanted the condo, arguing that she had stable employment and could afford the mortgage while I was between jobs. She offered to buy out my share of the equity at current market value, which would give me $40,000 plus half the savings. I didn't have the resources to fight for the condo even if I wanted it. Living there would mean constant reminders of the marriage and the betrayal, and I couldn't afford the monthly payments without employment anyway. I agreed to her proposal, signed the necessary paperwork, and waited for the divorce to be finalized. By month 4 of unemployment, my enhanced severance was running low. I'd been living cheaply, staying in extended stay hotels, and then moving to a small studio apartment in a less expensive part of the city. But the costs added up faster than I'd anticipated. I needed income, even if it wasn't in my field, even if it meant taking a massive step backward in my career progression. I applied for contract positions, temporary roles, anything that would bring in money while I continued searching for permanent product management work. Most of these applications went unanswered, victims of the same reference problem that was blocking my professional opportunities. Finally, I landed a contract position as a project coordinator at a small marketing agency. The role was 3 levels below where I'd been, paid $40 an hour with no benefits, and had nothing to do with product management. But it was income, and the agency didn't require references beyond confirmation that I'd actually worked where I claimed to have worked. The work was mind-numbing. I spent my days organizing spreadsheets, scheduling meetings, taking notes in client calls, and handling administrative tasks that could have been done by someone with a year of professional experience. My manager was a woman in her late 20s who'd been promoted to director after 2 years with the company. She treated me like an assistant, which I suppose I was, and seemed uncomfortable with the fact that I was 10 years older and clearly overqualified for the role. I did the work anyway. I showed up on time, completed my tasks efficiently, kept my head down, and my frustrations private. I needed the money, and I couldn't afford to lose another job, even a temporary contract position that barely covered my basic expenses. The reset. The breakthrough came 6 months after my termination from Meridian, through a connection I'd almost forgotten I had. Tom Reeves was someone I'd worked with briefly 4 years earlier, before he'd left Meridian to join Apex Innovations, one of our main competitors in the enterprise software space. We'd stayed loosely connected on LinkedIn, exchanging occasional messages about industry news or product launches, but we weren't close friends or regular contacts. Tom reached out with a direct message asking if I'd be interested in interviewing for a product manager role at Apex. The position wasn't senior level, just product manager without the senior designation, but it was a legitimate role with a good salary and the chance to get back into actual product work instead of administrative coordination. I was hesitant to respond. Tom would surely ask why I'd left Meridian, and I didn't have a good answer that wouldn't raise red flags. But I was also desperate, tired of the contract work and the financial uncertainty, tired of feeling like my career had been derailed permanently by circumstances beyond my control. I replied honestly. I told Tom I'd been terminated from Meridian under circumstances I believed were unfair and retaliatory, related to a personal situation involving my former manager. I didn't go into detail about David and Jennifer, but I made it clear that the termination hadn't been based on legitimate performance issues. Tom's response surprised me. He said he'd heard rumors about my departure, and that several former Meridian employees now at Apex had mentioned the situation. He said Apex's leadership was aware of David Chen's reputation and had concerns about his management practices. If I was interested in interviewing, Tom would advocate for me internally and help navigate any reference check issues. The interview process took 3 weeks. I met with 4 different people, including Tom, the VP of Product, and the Chief Product Officer. Each interview focused on my actual work experience, my approach to product strategy and execution, my technical knowledge, and leadership capabilities. No one asked directly about my termination from Meridian, though it was clear they knew something had happened. The offer came on a Friday afternoon. Product manager position, base salary of $120,000 plus bonus potential and standard benefits. It was 30% less than I'd been making at Meridian, and the title was a step backward, but it was a real job with a real company. I accepted immediately. My start date was 3 weeks out, enough time to finish my contract with the marketing agency and take a brief break before beginning at Apex. I gave notice to the agency, thanking them for the opportunity and maintaining the professional courtesy even though I was counting the days until I could leave that role behind. The first week at Apex was standard onboarding, HR paperwork, benefits enrollment, IT setup, orientation sessions about company culture and product strategy. I was assigned to a team working on enterprise project management software, reporting to a director named Lisa Chen. No relation to David, different spelling of the last name, but I still felt a slight tension when I heard the name for the first time. Lisa seemed competent and straightforward in our initial meetings. She explained the team's goals for the next quarter, introduced me to my colleagues one by one, and gave me time to review product documentation and get up to speed on current initiatives. The team dynamic seemed healthy and professional. Nothing felt unusual or concerning until the afternoon of my third day, when she asked me to join her for a private meeting in one of the small conference rooms on our floor. Not her office, but a conference room, which suggested this was formal, important, requiring privacy. The question. Lisa closed the door behind us and sat across from me at the small conference table. She had a notebook and a pen in front of her, but she didn't open the notebook or prepare to take notes. Her posture was professional, but not aggressive, concerned, but not hostile. This wasn't a formal performance discussion or project review. This was something else, something more personal and more significant. She started by acknowledging that my hire had gone through an unusual approval process. Normally, she explained, product manager candidates would need strong references from their most recent supervisor, and any not eligible for rehire. Flag would typically disqualify them immediately. But Apex's leadership had waived that requirement in my case based on recommendations from Tom Reeves and others who'd worked with me previously at Meridian. She wanted me to know that the company was taking a deliberate chance on me, and that they'd done so after carefully considering the circumstances of my departure and evaluating whether those circumstances reflected poorly on my actual capabilities as a product manager or on problems within Meridian's management. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Did David Chen ever ask you to stay quiet about his relationship with your wife? Did he offer you anything to keep the situation private? The directness of it stunned me. This wasn't a vague inquiry about workplace conflicts or interpersonal issues. This was a specific, targeted question about exactly what had happened between David, Jennifer, and me. Lisa knew something concrete, had information that went far beyond industry gossip or speculation. I answered honestly. I told her that David hadn't explicitly asked me to stay quiet, because I'd discovered the affair only 10 days before being terminated. There hadn't been time for negotiation or hush-money discussions, but the termination itself had felt like an attempt to remove me from the situation before I could make problems for him or the company. Lisa nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. She explained that Apex had been aware of David Chen's behavior for years. He had a history of boundary violations with female employees, though nothing that had resulted in formal complaints or legal action. Several former Meridian employees who'd joined Apex had mentioned concerns about his management practices, including at least 2 other cases where employees had been terminated under questionable circumstances shortly after reporting problems with David's conduct. What had triggered Apex's deeper investigation into my situation was the timing. When Tom had recommended me for the product manager position, the recruiting team had done their standard reference check with Meridian's HR. The not eligible for rehire notation, combined with my excellent performance reviews from previous years, had raised questions. Why would a consistently high-performing employee suddenly be terminated for performance issues? Apex's HR and legal teams had reached out informally to contacts at Meridian, people in product development and engineering who'd worked with both David and me. The picture that emerged was consistent. I'd been a strong performer until suddenly I wasn't, and the timeline aligned precisely with when my personal situation became complicated by David's relationship with my wife. Apex couldn't prove wrongful termination, and they weren't trying to, but they had enough information to believe that my departure from Meridian said more about David's management failures than about my professional capabilities. That's why they had been willing to hire me without the standard reference from my most recent supervisor. Now, Lisa was asking me to provide my side of the story, not for gossip or revenge purposes, but to document what had actually happened. Apex was building a file of information about David's conduct, information they could potentially share with Meridian if the situation escalated or if other employees came forward with similar experiences. What the new company already knew. Lisa explained that David Chen's reputation in the industry was significantly worse than I'd realized during my time reporting to him. He'd been with Meridian for 12 years, steadily moving up the corporate ladder from product manager to senior product manager to director to VP of product development. His technical skills were genuinely strong, his product instincts generally sound, and he'd overseen several successful launches that had generated substantial revenue for the company. But his interpersonal conduct, particularly with female employees and in situations involving personal relationships, had been problematic for most of his tenure in leadership roles. There had been at least 4 documented instances, Lisa said, where female employees on David's teams had left Meridian abruptly and unexpectedly, followed by unusually generous severance packages and strict non-disparagement agreements that bound them to silence about their reasons for leaving. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Talented women would join David's teams, perform well for 6 to 12 months, and then suddenly resign with vague explanations about pursuing other opportunities or personal reasons, followed by payouts that were substantially larger than standard severance for voluntary resignation. Apex's informal network of former Meridian employees included 2 women who'd been on the receiving end of David's unwanted attention and pressure. Neither had filed formal complaints with Meridian's HR or sued the company for harassment, partly because the severance packages they'd been offered included substantial payments that were explicitly contingent on maintaining confidentiality and signing releases of all claims, and partly because both women knew from experience and observation that fighting these battles publicly in the tech industry often caused more lasting damage to the victim's career than to the perpetrator's reputation. Companies circled their wagons, lawyers constructed narratives that cast doubt on accusers' motives, and women who spoke up found themselves labeled as difficult or litigious in ways that followed them to future opportunities. But the women had talked privately with trusted colleagues and friends within the industry. Those conversations had created a shadow reputation for David that existed alongside his official professional standing, a whispered understanding among people who'd worked at Meridian, or knew people who had, that David was someone to be cautious around, someone whose professional judgment could be compromised by personal interests, someone who wielded his authority in ways that served him rather than the company or his team members. When employees left Meridian for Apex, which happened regularly given the company's competition for talent, they sometimes mentioned David as a reason for their departure. Not always directly, but in cautious language about difficult management situations or toxic team dynamics that made it clear who and what they were talking about. Apex's leadership had been tracking these patterns for years. They'd considered reporting their concerns to Meridian's executive team or board, but without formal complaints or willing witnesses, there wasn't much to report beyond rumors and suspicions. And making accusations against a competitor's executive based on informal gossip could backfire badly, potentially exposing Apex to defamation claims or poisoning the professional relationships between the two companies. My situation was different because it was documented. The affair with Jennifer wasn't a secret accusation from an anonymous source. It was a verifiable relationship that had led to a divorce filing. The termination was documented in my employment record, the timeline was clear and undeniable, and I was willing to talk about what had happened, to put my name on a statement describing the sequence of events. Lisa asked if I'd be willing to document everything in a formal written statement. When I'd discovered the affair, what I'd observed about David and Jennifer's relationship, the circumstances of my termination, and my perception of whether the performance claims had any legitimate basis. She emphasized that this statement would be kept confidential within Apex's legal and HR departments, and would only be used if Meridian opened a formal investigation or if other situations arose where the documentation became relevant. I agreed. What did I have to lose? The worst had already happened. I'd lost my marriage and my job, spent 6 months in professional limbo, and restarted my career at a lower level. Documenting what David had done couldn't make my situation worse, and maybe it would prevent him from doing the same thing to someone else. I spent the next week writing out everything I could remember. The dates when I'd discovered the affair, specific text messages I'd read on Jennifer's laptop, the timeline of my termination, the lack of documentation or warning about performance issues, the pressure to sign a separation agreement without being given time to consult a lawyer. I tried to stick to facts rather than interpretations, to describe what happened rather than what I believed had motivated it. Lisa reviewed the statement and asked some clarifying questions. Were there witnesses to any of the conversations? Had I saved any of the text messages or other evidence? Did I have copies of my performance reviews that showed the contrast between my actual record and the claims made during my termination? I had kept copies of my performance reviews, stored in my personal email as PDFs. I hadn't saved the text messages from Jennifer's laptop, but I could provide specific dates and locations where I knew they'd met based on what I'd read. There weren't witnesses to the termination meeting beyond David and Sarah from HR, but the fact that HR had been present suggested the company knew this was a sensitive situation requiring documentation. The process. 3 weeks after I submitted my statement, Lisa called me into another private meeting. This time, Tom Reeves and Apex's chief legal officer, a woman named Patricia Moss, were also present. Patricia explained that Apex had decided to share my statement and their compiled information about David Chen with Meridian's board of directors. They weren't filing a formal complaint or threatening legal action. They were simply providing information that suggested one of Meridian's senior executives might be creating legal liability for the company through his personal conduct and management decisions. The decision to escalate had been driven by 2 factors. First, Apex had recently hired another former Meridian employee who'd reported similar concerns about David's behavior toward a female colleague. The new information, combined with my documented case, suggested a pattern rather than isolated incidents. Second, Apex's legal team believed they had an ethical obligation to share information about potential harassment and retaliation, even if it involved a competitor, because allowing the behavior to continue could harm more employees. Patricia was careful to emphasize that this wasn't about revenge or competitive advantage. If anything, sharing this information could strengthen Meridian by giving them the chance to address problems in their management ranks. Apex's motivation was primarily about industry ethics and preventing future harm, not about damaging a competitor. She asked if I had any objection to them sharing my statement with Meridian's board. I said I didn't. If anything, I wished I'd had the courage to report David's behavior immediately instead of just accepting my termination and moving on. Maybe I could have prevented him from targeting other people if I'd been willing to fight at the time. Patricia said that was a common response, and it reflected a larger problem with how companies handled these situations. Employees who'd been harmed often felt they had no power to fight back, and companies benefited from that silence by avoiding liability and maintaining the illusion of proper conduct. Breaking that pattern required people like me to be willing to document what happened, even when it felt uncomfortable or risky. Apex sent their documentation to Meridian's board in mid-January, about 4 months after I'd started my new job. I wasn't directly involved in the communication or aware of the specific contents of what they shared, but Patricia told me they'd included my statement along with statements from 2 other former Meridian employees, all documenting concerns about David's conduct and decision-making. The consequences. Meridian's initial response was defensive. Their legal team sent a letter to Apex accusing them of interfering with business relationships and threatening to sue for defamation if they continued making unfounded allegations against Meridian employees. The letter claimed that all employment decisions at Meridian were made according to proper procedures and that any suggestion otherwise was false and malicious. But behind the scenes, Meridian's board had apparently taken the information seriously enough to launch an internal investigation. They brought in an outside law firm to review David's personnel decisions over the past 3 years, looking specifically at terminations and departures of employees who'd worked directly with or for him. The investigation took 2 months of careful work by the outside law firm. During that entire time, David continued working in his role as VP of Product Development, attending meetings, making decisions, managing his teams, apparently unaware that his employment was being scrutinized by the board and outside investigators. Or maybe he knew and was confident that nothing would come of it, that his 12 years with the company and his track record of successful product launches and revenue generation would protect him from any serious consequences. Senior executives often believed they were untouchable, that the value they brought to the company made them effectively immune to accountability for personal conduct issues. The results of the investigation were shared with Apex in mid-March, approximately 2 months after Apex had sent their documentation to Meridian's board. Patricia Moss, Apex's chief legal officer, received a detailed call from Meridian's outside counsel explaining that they'd found sufficient concerns to take action regarding David Chen's employment and management practices. The conversation was carefully worded, protected by attorney-client privilege and confidentiality agreements, but the substance was clear enough for Patricia to understand that Meridian was taking the matter seriously. The specific findings weren't disclosed to Patricia or to me in complete detail, partly because of legal confidentiality requirements and partly because Meridian was still working through the implications and potential liability of what they'd discovered. But the summary that was shared made the core problems obvious. David had violated multiple company policies regarding conflicts of interest, appropriate management conduct, and disclosure obligations to HR and senior leadership. His relationship with Jennifer, while I was still his direct report, had created an undisclosed conflict of interest that should have required him to immediately recuse himself from any employment decisions or performance evaluations involving me. Company policy was explicit about this. Managers who had personal relationships with employees' family members had to disclose those relationships and remove themselves from any supervisory authority over the affected employees. David had done neither. He'd continued to supervise me, evaluate my performance, and ultimately make the decision to terminate my employment, all while sleeping with my wife and never once mentioning this massive conflict to HR or to his own supervisors. Additionally, the investigators had found concerning patterns in other employment decisions David had made over his years in leadership. While they couldn't conclusively prove wrongful termination in any specific case beyond mine, the combination of factors across multiple situations suggested management practices that exposed the company to significant legal risk. Unexplained terminations of employees who might have had personal information about David's conduct, unusually generous severance packages offered to departing employees who signed strict confidentiality agreements, and a pattern of female employees leaving his teams under circumstances that suggested harassment or inappropriate pressure. David was placed on immediate administrative leave while the board considered appropriate discipline. 2 weeks later, Meridian announced internally that David Chen had resigned from his position to pursue other opportunities. The announcement thanked him for his years of service and wished him well in his future endeavors. The standard corporate language for departures that weren't entirely voluntary. More significantly for my career and future prospects, Meridian's HR department reached out directly to me, using contact information they had in my personnel file, asking if I'd be willing to discuss correction of my employment record and remediation for the damage their procedural failures had caused. The outreach came through a senior HR director I'd never worked with directly, someone who'd been brought in specifically to handle the fallout from the investigation and David's departure. The remediation package they offered was comprehensive and carefully constructed to address both my immediate financial needs and my longer-term career concerns. First, they would reclassify my termination from terminated for cause due to performance issues to resignation by mutual agreement, which would completely remove the toxic not eligible for rehire notation from my employment record. That single change was worth more than any amount of money they could have offered, because it meant I could pursue better opportunities without the shadow of my Meridian termination following me and poisoning every reference check and background investigation. Second, they would provide neutral references for any future employers who called to verify my employment. The reference would confirm my dates of employment, my final title as senior product manager, my major responsibilities and projects, and most importantly would state that I'd left the company in good standing and would be eligible for rehire if I ever chose to return. That last phrase, eligible for rehire, was the complete opposite of the flag that had been killing my job applications for months, and it effectively signaled to future employers that whatever had caused my departure hadn't been a serious problem with my performance or professional conduct. Third, And finally, they included a settlement payment of $50,000 to compensate for the lost wages during my months of unemployment, the diminished earning potential from having to take a lower-level position at my next job, and the general damage to my professional reputation and career trajectory that their procedural failures had caused. $50,000 wasn't enough to fully compensate for 6 months of unemployment and the stress and uncertainty I'd endured, but it was a meaningful acknowledgement that the company had made serious mistakes in how they'd handled my termination. In exchange, I had to sign a release agreement waiving any potential claims against the company for wrongful termination, retaliation, or related employment issues. I also had to agree to confidentiality regarding the settlement terms, though I could discuss the fact that my employment record had been corrected. Rachel Park, my employment lawyer, reviewed the offer and advised me to accept it. The settlement amount was reasonable given the circumstances, and the correction of my employment record was worth more than the money. With a clean reference and no "not eligible for rehire" flag, I could pursue better opportunities without the shadow of my Meridian termination following me everywhere. I signed the agreement and received the settlement payment 3 weeks later. More importantly, I received confirmation that my employment record had been updated and that HR would provide the agreed-upon neutral references for any future verification requests. Personal fallout. Jennifer learned about the investigation from David, who'd apparently called her in an absolute panic when he was first placed on administrative leave. She tried to reach me multiple times over the following days and weeks, leaving voicemails that evolved dramatically in tone and content as she began to understand the scope of what was happening. Her first messages, left within hours of David's suspension, were angry and accusatory. She blamed me for destroying David's career out of vindictiveness, claimed I'd been petty and vengeful, that I'd ruined his professional life because I couldn't accept that our marriage had ended. She said I should have just found a new job quietly and let her and David be happy together instead of dragging everyone through drama. But as days passed and she learned more about what Meridian's investigation had uncovered, the tone shifted dramatically. Anger gave way to fear. She wanted to know what I'd told Meridian, what evidence I'd provided, whether I'd mentioned her specifically or implied she'd been involved in the decision to terminate me. She was worried about her own job, terrified that the investigation might expand to examine her role in providing David with information about my work and projects. I didn't respond to any of the messages. There was nothing to say. I hadn't destroyed David's career. He'd done that himself by engaging in an inappropriate relationship with the wife of one of his direct reports and then using his authority to terminate me when the situation became inconvenient. I'd simply documented what happened and allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Jennifer's relationship with David didn't survive the investigation. According to mutual friends who'd stayed in contact with her, David had blamed her for the exposure, claiming she should have been more discreet, should have made sure I never found out, should have handled the situation better. She blamed him for being reckless, for not considering the potential consequences of terminating me without proper documentation or justification. The relationship that had seemed worth destroying, a 9-year marriage, fell apart under the pressure of real consequences. When the fantasy collided with reality, when their actions had to be explained and justified rather than just enjoyed in secret hotel rooms, they turned on each other with predictable bitterness. Jennifer eventually left her job at the company where she'd been working, though I never learned whether she'd been pushed out or had chosen to leave on her own terms. Mutual friends mentioned she'd moved to a different city, started over somewhere else where her reputation hadn't preceded her. David had a significantly harder time recovering professionally than Jennifer. Word had spread quickly in the tech industry about his forced resignation from Meridian and the circumstances surrounding it, traveling through the informal networks of recruiters, former colleagues, and industry contacts that make up the professional ecosystem. He'd been a VP at a well-respected company, a position of significant authority and responsibility, and his sudden departure after 12 years of employment raised questions that couldn't be adequately answered in job interviews or reference checks. When potential employers called Meridian to verify his employment, they received similar minimal information to what I'd received: dates of service, final title, and confirmation that he was not eligible for rehire. That phrase carried even more weight for a senior executive than it had for me, because VPs don't typically leave companies involuntarily unless something serious has gone wrong. Companies conducting executive searches did more thorough due diligence, talked to more people, dug deeper into candidates' backgrounds and reputations, and what they found when they investigated David was concerning. Rumors of inappropriate relationships with employees' family members, questions about the circumstances of several terminations he'd overseen, suggestions of conflicts of interest that hadn't been properly managed or disclosed. I heard through the professional network, through Tom Reeves and other former Meridian colleagues who'd moved to various companies, that David had taken a director-level position at a smaller software company about 6 months after leaving Meridian. It was a significant step down from where he'd been, both in title and in the caliber and visibility of the company. The role paid less, offered less authority, came with less prestige in the industry. It was the kind of position someone might take when they needed employment but had limited options due to reputation issues or gaps in their work history. Ending. I stayed at Apex Innovations and built the kind of career I'd thought I'd lost permanently when David terminated me from Meridian. The product manager role I'd started with evolved over the following year into a senior product manager position, restoring not just the title, but also the salary and professional standing I'd lost. My compensation increased to match and then exceed what I'd been making at Meridian. I led successful product launches, built strong relationships with engineering and design teams, earned the respect of colleagues who judged me based on my actual capabilities rather than on rumors or problematic reference checks from my previous employer. My professional reputation rebuilt itself naturally over time, not through aggressive self-promotion or attempts to explain away my departure from Meridian, but through consistent delivery of quality work and professional conduct that spoke for itself. People in the industry who'd heard vague rumors about why I'd left my previous role eventually learned the truth through the informal network of former Meridian employees, and the narrative shifted from "there must be something wrong with him" to "he got caught in a bad situation with a problematic manager." The experience fundamentally changed how I approached workplace relationships and professional judgment going forward. I became more cautious about trust, maintaining clearer boundaries between my personal and professional lives. I was more attentive to office dynamics and power imbalances, more aware of how personal situations could intersect with professional consequences in ways that destroyed careers and reputations. Not paranoid or cynical, but realistic about the ways people could use authority and access to cause harm, and thoughtful about protecting myself from similar situations. I dated cautiously in the years following the divorce, keeping romantic relationships completely separate from my work life, maintaining boundaries that I'd been too trusting to enforce during my marriage with Jennifer. I wasn't bitter about relationships generally, or convinced that all people were capable of the kind of betrayal I'd experienced, but I'd learned that trust had to be earned incrementally and verified through consistent behavior rather than simply assumed based on history or declared commitment. Actions mattered more than words. Patterns over time revealed character more accurately than promises or professions of love. The settlement money from Meridian, $50,000 after taxes, helped me rebuild my financial stability relatively quickly. I used it as a down payment on a small house instead of continuing to rent, invested in retirement accounts that had been depleted during the months of unemployment and reduced income, and created an emergency fund substantial enough to sustain me through 6 months of expenses if I ever faced another unexpected job loss or career disruption. Most significantly, on a deeper level than just the practical recovery of my career and finances, I learned that documentation and procedure could be more powerful tools than direct confrontation or emotional appeals to justice. I'd never yelled at David or Jennifer, never confronted them publicly about what they'd done, never tried to rally colleagues or friends or family to my side in some kind of public relations battle over who was right and who was wrong. I just documented what happened as accurately and completely as I could, provided facts when asked by people who had authority to act on those facts, and allowed institutions to follow their own procedures for addressing problems that created legal liability and reputational risk. That approach had proven far more effective than any confrontational strategy could have been. David lost his VP position, not because I accused him publicly or destroyed his reputation through gossip, but because Apex provided Meridian with documented evidence that forced the company's board to examine whether they were exposed to liability for his management practices. Jennifer's career stalled not because I spread rumors about her role in the situation, but because professional networks are small and people talk, and eventually her choices and actions became known to enough people that her reputation suffered natural consequences. She thought sleeping with my boss would make her powerful, would give her access to resources and connections and opportunities that I couldn't provide. She thought having a relationship with a VP would elevate her life, bring her the excitement and status she'd been seeking throughout our marriage. She thought I was the limitation, the boring husband with his stable career and comfortable routine, holding her back from something better and more glamorous. It just put everything on record. The hotel reservations and text messages documenting a 5-month affair, the undisclosed conflict of interest that violated clear company policies. The termination of a high-performing employee 10 days after he discovered the relationship without proper documentation or justification. The pattern of similar situations with other employees over years of management, All of it recorded, documented, subject to review by investigators whose job was to identify liability and prevent future problems for their client company. And once it was on record, once the documentation existed and had been shared with people who had both the authority and the institutional incentive to act on it, the power dynamic shifted completely and irreversibly. David's position and seniority couldn't protect him from an investigation that found clear policy violations. Jennifer's relationship with him became a liability rather than an asset once people understood how it had been used to facilitate inappropriate employment decisions. I didn't need revenge in any dramatic or satisfying sense because I had something much more effective: detailed documentation, proper procedures followed carefully, and institutions that valued their own legal protection over the careers of individual executives who'd created risk. That combination was more powerful than any personal confrontation or public accusation could have been, and it left me with a clear conscience and a rebuilt career that I'd earned through my actual capabilities rather than through connections or office politics. David and Jennifer had to live with the consequences of their choices playing out in documented reality rather than remaining in the private fantasy of hotel rooms and secret messages. They had to face investigations and career damage and the collapse of a relationship that had seemed worth destroying a marriage and a career to pursue. And I got to move forward with my life knowing that I'd handled the situation with integrity and professionalism, even when it would have been easier or more emotionally satisfying to stay silent and accept what had happened as inevitable. The lesson I carried forward wasn't about revenge or justice or any kind of dramatic reversal of fortune. It was simpler and more practical than that. Document what happens, follow the procedures that exist for addressing problems, and trust that institutions will eventually act in their own interests by addressing conduct that creates legal liability or reputational risk. Sometimes, when the facts are clear and the violations are obvious, that's enough to create meaningful consequences without any need for confrontation or drama. She thought sleeping with my boss made her powerful. It just put everything on record.